Hi and welcome to lecture 14. In this lecture we'll discuss the 3 levels of access control in Ruby. We'll talk about the whole idea of controlling access in the first place, as well as how private is private access in Ruby. So the idea of access control is as follows. When you're designing your class, it's important to think about how much of it you want to expose to the world. You want to write your class in a way that when something changes, some internal details change in your class, not everybody outside of your class has to all of a sudden change everything. You want to keep your representation, the internal representation, private. That's the idea of encapsulation, and it applies to not just Ruby but other languages, other OO languages as well. On top of that, Ruby also provides 3 levels of access control: public, protected, and private. And we'll see what these mean in a minute. So the idea of encapsulation is as follows. Let's say you have a car class that maybe has a speed and comfort, which are used to calculate the rating of a car. And you have a rating method that right now happens to return the rating, which is an instance variable. But maybe later on, you're going to incorporate some other factors how you calculate the rating. So that's fine, because the people who depend on the car class, they're still going to have this rating method, and to them, it doesn't mean anything. It's just a rating method, which is a method that they call. And even if internal representation changes in how you calculate the rating, that's okay. It's not going to affect the outside API. So there are 2 ways you could specify access control in Ruby. Number 1, you could specify public, protected, or private keywords, and everything until the next access control keyword will be of that access control level. Now, this is in addition to what I mentioned before, that by default, all Ruby methods are public. So if you don't specify any of these, your methods are going to be public. The second way is you could define the methods regularly without specifying whether they are public, private, or protected. And then you could have a comma-separated list of methods using the method symbols to specify whether they are private, protected, or public. So let's see both of these. We have a class on the left that starts out as private. So this method test1 and any other method defined here will be private until protected. And this method over here and all the other methods will be protected. And then you have public, which basically says that any methods defined here are going to be public. And you obviously need public here because otherwise they will be protected. Whereas usually if you wouldn't have any of these private, protected, or public, or if you would have this method all the way up before private, you wouldn't need any keyword because the methods by default in Ruby are public. Because the idea is if you're creating a method, you probably want somebody from outside the class to call the method. The other way to do it is you define a method regular, and then you say, oh, by the way, test1 method that I defined earlier, I want it to be private, and you could do this using a comma-separated list of method names. Now, let's talk about what the public, protected, and private actually means. So public methods means there's no access control enforced. Anybody from outside the class or from inside the class can call this method. Protected means it can be invoked, but only by the objects of a defining class or its subclasses. Nobody from outside, unless you're a subclass, can call a protected method. And the third level is really interesting. Private methods cannot be invoked with an explicit receiver. So you cannot say, for example, let's say you create an instance of a class. Let's say call it person1. You cannot say person1 dot a private method. But not only that, even to say something like self dot private method inside the class itself you cannot do. And there is a minor exception which we'll see in a minute. So let's see an example of this. Let's say we have a person that has my age getter and age setter. So to say something like self.myAge, even inside the constructor of a person class is illegal. You cannot use self or any other receiver to call a private method. The only exception is to call an age setter. And the reason is because calling an age setter without a receiver, without a self, as we discussed earlier when we talked about classes, is kind of useless because the Ruby interpreter would interpret the age as a local variable, and by the time you finished the constructor, the age local variable would go out of scope. So the only meaningful way of calling a age setter is to call it using self. So therefore, this is an exception. When you're trying to set a variable value, you are allowed to call self even if the age setter is a private method. In summary, public and private access controls are used the most. Sometimes you'll see protected, but most of the time you'll see people just using public if a method's a public, or not using anything because by default methods are public, or using private if you don't want anybody calling the methods. And private methods are very interesting in that they're not callable from outside or inside the class with an explicit receiver, and the exception to that is a setter method, a method that's trying to set a value. Those methods are allowed to be called with a receiver, as we saw. What's next? Next, we'll talk about introduction to unit testing.